In the lobby of the American Museum of Natural History is a cast of the sauropod dinosaur Barosaurus, which is rearing up to defend its young from a carnivorous Allosaurus. A second cast is present in the Natural History Museum of Utah, and a genuine skeleton is on display at the Royal Ontario Museum. Despite these exhibits, Barosaurus remains obscure to the general public, and to most others is perceived as just a slightly different version of the more famous Diplodocus with a longer neck. However, new fossil material has shown that Barosaurus was an exceptional, record-breaking dinosaur. Not only was it massive, but it may be the longest sauropod dinosaur known to science. Barosaurus is found in the Morrison Formation in western North America, which was formed about 150 million years ago during the Late Jurassic period. This is the same formation that includes household names like Brontosaurus, Apatosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Stegosaurus, Ceratosaurus, and Allosaurus. Barosaurus was also once thought to have been present in late Jurassic Africa, though the fossils formerly assigned to Barosaurus there have since been given their own genus, Tornaria. Like many of its more famous relatives and contemporaries, Barosaurus was found during the Bone Wars, a famous rivalry between the paleontologists Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. The Barosaurus holotype was excavated by Marsh and his team in 1889 and named during the following year. A later description of some Barosaurus fossils in 1999 was also the last scientific paper written by Marsh. While no complete Barosaurus skeleton has been found, almost the entire skeleton, besides the skull, feet, and the end of its tail, is accounted for. Barosaurus was a member of Diplodocidae, which also includes Brontosaurus, Apatosaurus, Supersaurus, and of course, Diplodocus. Diplodocids were relatively slender, at least for sauropods, and possessed whip-like tails and necks that were long even by sauropod standards. Diplodocid forelimbs were also short compared to other sauropods, though Barosaurus's forelimbs were longer than most other diplodocids. In most regards, Barosaurus was very similar to Diplodocus, though Barosaurus's neck was both longer and wider. Part of this length was because Barosaurus had converted one of its dorsal vertebrae into a 16th cervical or neck vertebra. But most of this extra length was because Barosaurus's cervical vertebrae were longer than those of Diplodocus, sometimes by as much as 50%. However, Barosaurus's neural spines were shorter than those of Diplodocus, perhaps to save weight for its longer neck. Its tail vertebrae were also shorter, resulting in a proportionally shorter tail. But the most notable difference between the two was Barosaurus's sheer size. Barosaurus's full name is Barosaurus lentus, which means slow, heavy lizard. This was a fitting name for an animal of its original estimated size. The second largest specimen is about 27 meters long and had a weight between 15 to 20 metric tons, a decently sized sauropod on par with Diplodocus, but not exceptional. However, while previously treated as not far off from Barosaurus's true adult size, like most sauropod specimens, this estimate was not based on a fully grown individual. The largest Barosaurus specimen is a gigantic cervical vertebra which was previously misassigned to Supersaurus. It is nearly 1.5 meters long, longer than any other neck bone ever found. Scaling this bone to other Barosaurus skeletons gives a length of 45 meters and a weight of about 60 tons. This is truly exceptional, and these are conservative estimates. Such a size dwarfs the previous estimates of Barosaurus' size and is larger than any other known dinosaur from the Morrison Formation, even Brachiosaurus and Supersaurus. It is also longer than any other known sauropod dinosaur, and therefore any terrestrial tetrapod. With an estimated neck length of 15 meters, it also had the longest neck of any of the long necks, even longer than the neck of Mamenchisaurus. Not only that, but Barosaurus' weight was not far from the estimated weights of contenders for the title of heaviest sauropod, such as Argentinosaurus and Patagotitan. Comparisons may at first make Barosaurus appear larger, though Barosaurus probably wasn't that much of a record breaker. With its slender, diplodocid build, Barosaurus ultimately weighed less than these heavyweights. However, unlike the other megasauropods, who are only known from fairly limited remains, almost all of Barosaurus' skeleton is known, albeit from immature individuals. Of course, without a complete skeleton, it is impossible to know for sure if the massive cervical vertebra is from Barosaurus lentus, a new species of Barosaurus, or a new genus of sauropod closely related to Barosaurus. Still, since all of the other smaller Barosaurus fossils are from juveniles, and Barosaurus lentus is already fairly rare, it is likely the large specimen and the smaller ones are from the same species. Either way, heavy lizard is an appropriate name for such a titanic animal. That said, very few Barosaurus would actually reach their full adult size. Sauropods laid numerous eggs, of which very few lived to reproduce. Even though sauropods grew fast, it would still take a very long time to reach 60 tons, and without parental care, most would be eaten by predators well before then. Therefore, while adult mortality was low, at any given time, there was a lot more Barosaurus alive who were the size of those on display at museums than the much rarer, titanic adults. While its long neck may have been record-breaking, Barosaurus wasn't able to move it very high. Though its neck had good lateral flexibility, it had reduced vertical flexibility compared to other sauropods. Its long neck is instead thought to have allowed it to forage over a very wide area without having to move its body. It is also speculated Diplodocids may have been able to rear up, greatly expanding their browsing options, though this remains controversial. However, even if it couldn't raise its neck very high, its sheer size would have still allowed it to browse relatively high foliage. One factor that further complicates determining what Barosaurus ate is the lack of a fossilized skull. Sauropod skulls are rare in general due to their solution of how to deal with conflicting evolutionary pressure. They needed to reduce the weight of the skull so it could be supported by their long necks. At the same time, their heads still needed to be large enough to support their senses and be able to ingest sufficient amounts of food. To achieve this, sauropod skulls were made up of many hollow spaces and fragile bones, which were not always tightly connected to each other. While effective in life, they had poor preservation potential in death. Without an actual skull of Barosaurus, it is assumed to have had one similar to other closely related diplodocids, which were relatively low and elongated. They had peg-like teeth only found at the front of the jaws, which were used for stripping leaves. While extinct, one Barosaurus had an interesting story happen to it millions of years after its death. In 1962, the Royal Ontario Museum traded the skeletons of two hadrosaurs with the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in exchange for what they thought was a Diplodocus skeleton, which was only later learned to belong to Barosaurus. They hoped to add it to a refurbished exhibit, but when it turned out there was not enough space for it, the Barosaurus was left in storage where it would sit for years until it was forgotten about. That changed in 2007. The Royal Ontario Museum was planning on making a new dinosaur exhibit, and assigned Associate Curator Dr. David Evans to find a new sauropod skeleton to be its centerpiece. While looking for options abroad, he came across a reference to a sauropod skeleton already at the Royal Ontario Museum. When he returned, he found the mostly complete Barosaurus, which wasn't recorded in the database and had been split up as isolated bones throughout the collection. Within 8 weeks, the skeleton was put on display with casts used to fill in the missing bones. It is now nicknamed Gordo, in honor of Dr. Gordon Edmond, the curator who originally tried to have it displayed. Gordo is currently the only Barosaurus skeleton on display in the world that contains the actual fossils, and is the largest mounted dinosaur skeleton in Canada. But as large as Gordo was, it died long before it could reach even 2/3 of its full length. Despite how exceptional it is, few people know about Barosaurus, and even fewer are aware of just how massive it was. Perhaps one day, Barosaurus will be as popular as its more well-known cousins it dwarfed. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something interesting. Have a great day, and If you enjoyed the video, please remember to hit the like button.